Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, SOITS, Diploma Postgraduate Diploma Programs, Postgraduate Diploma in Folklore and Culture Studies, PGDFCS, MFC 001 Folklore and Culture, Conceptual Perspectives, Block-1 Folklore, Issues and Methods, Unit-2 Brief History of Folklore Studies with special reference to India. 2.0 Objectives. After reading this unit, you will be able to understand the beginning and growth of folklore studies, in India in particular and in the other parts of the world in general, explain the ideological contexts for the study of and interest in folklore, and explain the diversity of perceptions about folklore in different places and at different times. 2.1 Introduction. In this unit, we will discuss in detail that although the folklore materials such as tales, songs, etc. are as old as human society, the systematic study of these materials, in the spirit of modern academics, is of relatively recent origin. The beginning of modern folklore studies can be traced back in the 19th century's Europe, especially in Germany, when scholars and intellectuals started giving serious interests in the collection and study of the folklore materials in various forms, such as folk tales, folk songs, traditional customs, etc., that existed in their surrounding societies. However, it is important to know that such interests on folklore resources, initially in Europe and later in other parts of the world, were triggered by diverse motivations that arose out of different social, political, and historical contexts, unlike the cases in more stable disciplines such as history and natural sciences. The growth and development of folklore studies as an academic subject had to pass through considerable differences and confusions. Such differences were primarily regarding the meaning of the term folklore itself, as the same term, folklore, was used to mean both the study and the materials of the subject. Besides that, different countries followed different practices to label a diverse set of cultural resources as folklore materials. In some parts of Europe and South America, the term folklore was used to mean the so-called unsophisticated peasant culture, the community performances of music, dance, and festival. In the United States, on the other hand, folklore was understood as the relics of the past, such as ballads, tales, and superstitions. Because of the very nature of folklore materials, they have been the subjects of study of scholars from various disciplines, such as literary studies, anthropology, psychology, history, etc. While this had resulted to enrich folklore studies with theoretical and methodological contributions from multiple disciplines, it also caused folklore studies to remain annexed to any one of these subjects in the institutional setups. Folklore studies could emerge as independent academic departments in universities and colleges only in the 20th century. 2.2 Early philology and the Grimm brothers. We may begin here with what is philology. Philology is the study of the historical development of languages. The philological inquiries mostly sought for the root or origin of languages and etymologies of different words in a language. In 19th century Germany, it was Jacob Grimm, 1785 to 1863, who emerged to be the most prominent activist in this field, who extensively collected German folklore materials for the purpose of his study on the root of German language. For his quest for the origin of German language, he collected and studied a great deal German words, folk narratives such as myths and tales. Eventually, he not only brought out the monumental German dictionary but also compiled, with his brother Wilhelm Grimm, 1786 to 1859, some very important books, such as Deutsche Mythologie, a seminal collection of German myths, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, children's and household tales, popularly known as Grimm's fairy tales, which imparted decisive influences in the study and publishing of folklore materials in later times. One thing to be noted regarding the works of Grimm brothers is that their engagement with the materials of folklore was not as that of the folklorists of present times. They took interest in folkloric resources as the means to trace the root of German language and also to collect everything that is German, a drive triggered by the romantic nationalist feeling which had been initiated by previous German scholars like Herder, Johann Gottfried von Herder, 1744 to 1803. Such romantic nationalist spirit in Germany and other parts of the Europe arose in the context of the emerging forces of industrialization that began to sweep away the traditional landscapes, the traditional cultural resources of the peasant communities were regarded by the intellectuals as the precious remnants of the glorious past. However, in their course of work, which was primarily a linguistic investigation, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm paved the way for the collection, methodology of study and publishing of folkloric materials. Influence of Jacob Grimm upon the European folklorists in subsequent times was enormous. His entire conceptual framework, which employed diachronic study of German oral poetry and narratives, influenced directly to the emergence of a theoretical perspective called mythological school in later times. 2.3 Watts J. Thoms and the word folklore. Let us now focus on the role of W. J. Thoms in folklore studies. It was the British antiquarian William John Thoms who coined word folklore in 1846. Prior to that, materials of folklore, in English, were referred randomly as popular antiquities or popular literature. In Germany, such resources were called as Volkskunde. W. J. Thoms, under the pseudonym of Ambrose Merton, wrote a letter to a journal titled The Athenaeum proposing that the singular word folklore should be used in English to denote the manners, customs, observances, superstitions, ballads, proverbs and other materials of the olden time. He argued that the word folklore, being the composite of folk, people, and lore, knowledge, would be a good Anglo-Saxon compound instead of all other somewhat cumbersome terms. His letter was published in the August of 1846, and his proposal was soon accepted widely. There are a number of significant aspects to be noted regarding Thoms' introducing of the word folklore. Firstly, he associated the notion of folklore with a nationalistic sentiment which was the primary motivation behind his approach to the issue. His English nationalistic sentiment can be felt through his phrases such as good Saxon compound for the word folklore. Secondly, he did not give any formal definition of folklore, though his letter reflects what he understood as the meaning of folklore. It was a past-oriented view where Thoms saw folklore as to mean the cultural relics of the bygone times. By introducing the word folklore, W. J. Thoms made the novel contribution of fixing the label for the resources and their study, which led to the establishment of an international discipline known as folklore, folklore studies or folkloristics. However, it is to be noted that the tasks of collection and study of folklore had begun much before Thoms coined the word. 2.4 Folklore and ideology. What is the relation between folklore and ideology? We will see that political, ideological motivation has been intricately connected with the beginning and growth of folklore studies in different parts of the world. The driving force behind the works of Grimm brothers in Germany was the romantic nationalist spirit that was initiated in German intellectual circles by Herder in 18th-19th century. The items of folklore, understood as the remnants of the past generations, were always charged with a kind of collective pride and national glory. Besides that, as folklore was initially understood as the lore of the unsophisticated peasant societies, they appeared to be purer assets of humanity and closer to the nature for many urban, elite intellectuals. Because of this, folklore materials enjoyed conscious care and adored during the age of Romanticism. Besides, in Germany, political and ideological motivations behind the attention to folklore, in varied degrees, were seen in Norway, Finland, Ireland, Soviet, Russia and India. In Germany during Hitler's regime, folklore resources were used with extreme Nazi racialist propaganda. In Soviet Russia, folklore was used as a powerful tool to advance communism. Dorson 1982-17. In such highly overt political drives, folklore was not only utilized but also created anew to meet specific socio-political goals of people. This defied the prevailing notion of folklore as static items received from the past. Folklore is an echo of the past, but at the same time it is also the vigorous voice of the present, stated by the Russian scholar Y. M. Sokolov. In India, the massive body of folklore materials in many racial and linguistic communities was studied and published in nationalistic spirit by the intellectuals and literary scholars of early 20th century. During Indian freedom struggle, folklore symbols were effectively portrayed for the construction of identity. 2.5 Different academic approaches. 2.5.1 Mythological school. After the works of the Jacob Grimm, the first theoretical perspective in study and analysis of folklore was put forward by Friedrich Max Müller, 1823–1900, a profound German philologist, Indologist and a great Sanskrit scholar. Max Müller drew on linguistic viewpoint to explain not only the meaning of myths, but also the process of myth creation. Being an authority on comparative religion, Max Müller strengthened the comparative methodology and diachronic approach of Jacob Grimm to formulate what was known as the mythological school of folklore studies. His theory attempted to explain the phenomenon of myth creation as the result of the semantic changes in language. He used the phrase malady of language, disease of language, to mean this change in language, which is a phenomenon where words and terms used by the primitive man at a particular stage of one language lose their original meanings at a later phase of the language and at the hands of later generations. Myths are created, according to Max Müller, as the explanatory narratives of such words and expressions by the later generations. This mythological school, which was championed mostly by Max Müller and few other scholars too, however, were abandoned in later times as its reconstruction of the prototype myth was proved to be too hypothetical. However, mythological theory is to be credited for being the first of its kind to attempt theoretical interpretation of folkloric forms such as myths. Also, the work of Max Müller was highly productive in shaping the methodology in the study of folklore. 2.5.2 Diffusion Migration Theory. Theodor Benfey, 1809–1881, was another German philologist and Orientalist who is best known for compiling the great Sanskrit-English dictionary. However, he made novel contribution to the theoretical and intellectual development of folklore studies through his translation of Indian anthology, the Pankatantra, into German language, with a highly comprehensive introduction in it. Benfey deciphered fascinating similarities between Sanskrit tales of ancient India and the tales of Europe. He opined that such similarities were not necessarily due to genetic relationship of people as thought by Max Müller. Rather, Benfey put forward the idea that folktales can and do travel across territories. He believed that it was the ancient India where all the folktales were originally produced, which later migrated to Europe and other parts of the world through various means of cultural contacts between peoples. Further, Benfey also attempted to construct the exact routes through which such folktales migrated from India to the rest of the world. This idea of monogenesis or atomistic origin of folk tales and other folk forms can be seen as the central theme of the works of philologists since Jacob Grimm and Max Muller. Benfey's theory and methods influenced in later times the historical geographical methods in Finland. 2.5.3 Anthropological perspectives. The rise in anthropological scholarship in 19th and 20th century in England and America brought out a strong anthropological perspective in the study of folklore. In fact, anthropology and folklore studies as academic fields share almost the same types of subject matters with differences only in perspectives and emphases. Folklorists, typically, have been studying the orally and verbally transmitted cultural resources more than the other types of resources, though modern folkloristics do encompass the study people's customs, material, cultural resources and art forms. However, this special attribution to oral tradition is not a feature in the works of anthropologists who study the material and non-material aspects of culture from functionalist viewpoints and see the cultural norms and values as predictable and theorizable patterns of human behavior. Some of the foremost scholars of classical anthropology drew heavily upon the folkloric resources which they collected through exhaustive fieldworks in distant places and diverse communities. The names which can be mentioned in this line are E. B. Tyler, 1832–1917, and Andrew Lang, 1844–1912, in England, France, Boas, 1858–1942, Ruth Benedict, 1887–1948, M. J. Herskowitz, 1895–1963, in the United States. E. B. Tyler, in his famous book Primitive Culture, advocated that folklore, understood as the customs and beliefs of the peasant societies, could be worth studying in reconstructing the collective human activities of primitive times. Tyler and his follower Andrew Lang explained the similarities between cultural traits and practices amongst communities living in different geographical locations through the new concept of anthropological evolution of mankind. In sharp contrast to the idea of monogenesis and atomistic origin maintained by Max Muller and Theodor Benfey, this anthropological school put forward the notion of polygenesis and multiple origins of cultural and folkloric traits. According to this notion, a cultural trait or an item of folklore could have independently originated at two or more places unrelated to each other, either at the same time or at different times, but at similar stages of human progress. It was believed that evolution of mankind followed a singular universal path of progress in every place, with three absolutely identical stages everywhere: savagery, barbarism and civilization. 2.5. For Historical Geographical School, Theodor Benfey's hypothesis, as mentioned earlier, invoked a rigorous methodology in Finland to study the origin and migration of folklore items. This technical method, which was initially experimented in the study of the Finnish national epic Kalevala, was based on the notion that as folklore forms travel from place to place, they undergo changes in form and content yet retaining their basic recognizable features. Thus it was believed that not only the original forms of folklore items and could be reconstructed but the exact route of migration of those items also could be traced through thorough comparative exercise. It was known as Finnish method or historical geographical method because of its research along historical, original form, and geographical route of migration, scales. The major exponents of this method were Carle Crone, C.W. von Sydow, Archer Taylor, Stith Thompson and Axel Ulrich. Besides the precision techniques of comparative analysis of folklore data, a major development that arose out of this historical geographical method was the scientific way of breaking down folklore forms, such as folktales, into identifiable traits for cross-comparative analysis. Further development of this practice led in later time concept of motif in folklore texts, on which the American folklorist Stith Thompson compiles the Motif Index of Folk Literature 2.5.5 Psychoanalytical School. The works of the Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, on the unconscious self were highly influential in the 20th century academics. For his exploration of the human mind, he extensively studied folklore materials and brought out the books like The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899, Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious, 1905, and Totem and Taboo, 1913. He, and many of his followers of psychoanalytical school, used to see the myths, dreams, jokes, and tales as the symbolic expressions of the unconscious human mind. In his Interpretation of Dreams, Freud drew analogies between dreams and myths that dreams are the disguised reflection of the repressed desires of an individual in his or her subconscious mind, whereas the myths are the symbolic expressions of the collective unconsciousness of a race or culture. C. G. Jung, another stalwart of the psychoanalytical school, deciphered symbols of sexual drive in myths and other folk narratives. The influence of Freudian and post-Freudian psychoanalysis was enormous, both in academics and common public values of 20th century. In folklore studies, it brought out radically new theoretical and methodological perspectives. 2.5.6 Oral formulaic theory. In 1930, American literary scholar Milman Parry was working on the formulaic characters of the classical epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He extended his analysis of formulaic characteristics of classical epic to the Yugoslav oral poetry. His aim was to delineate the form of oral poetry and to compare it with the form written verses. After Parry's death in 1935, his method was taken up by Albert B. Lord, who published his book under the title The Singer of Tales in 1935. With his seminal methodology, he closely observed the unlettered oral poetry being performed or sung without reading and writing. It was observed that the epic singers memorize a set of formulas which enable them to carry on the traditional themes with reasonable accuracy and at the same time give them freedom to improvise new elements depending on the occasion without altering the form. Drastically, Handu 1989-50. The work of Parry and Lord remained influential in succeeding folklore scholarships. Besides imparting useful perspectives on narrative composition of oral poetry, it also initiated the trend in folklore studies to take folklore forms as more than texts, the performance or singing dimension, in their case of oral epics. An important thing to be noted that during the time of Parry and Lord's works, i.e. in the 1930s, the Russian formalist V. J. Prop was also working on similar lines, though Prop's work was on folktales and not oral poetry. Both the works were attempts to decipher the characteristics of narrative composition of folklore forms. 2.5.7 Structural School. Structuralism is an approach in which any field or object of study is treated as a system of interrelated parts. It was a popular and widely accepted perspective in several academic fields of 20th century. In folklore studies, the seed of structural analysis was planted by Vladimir J. Prop 1895 to 1970. The Russian formalist published his book Morphologia Сказки in Russian language in 1928, which was translated into English in 1958 as Morphology of the Folk Tale. In that remarkable book, Prop took an entirely new synchronic approach to the study of Russian folktales. Instead of the meanings of folktale, Prop analyzed their structural forms, component parts of the structures, and the interrelation amongst them. Regarding the issue of the similarities of folktales of different places, he was interested neither in finding origin of these similarities nor in random comparison and classification of the similar traits of tales. He showed that the vital components of a folktale are not its characters but certain actions of the characters, which are found to be constant in folktales of different places. The presence of such constant actions, which he called functions, are responsible for the similarities between different folktales. Claude Lévi-Strauss, an extraordinarily versatile French anthropologist, led another structuralist approach for the study of folklore forms. Lévi-Strauss, who applied his structural formulations to explain myth, kinship, and visual arts, followed complex interpretation schemes which he built on the concepts of Saussurean linguistics. Unlike Prop, Lévi-Strauss did not separate the form and content meaning of folklore texts. He treated myth as a higher and complex level of communication carrying mythic messages. These messages are logical formulations to be found in somewhat codified binary oppositional schemes, which are constructed in cultures to overcome the contradictions of human understandings. Lévi-Strauss believed that a universal structural scheme could be possible to explain entire myths around the world. 2.5.8 Contextual theory. Towards the late 20th century, along with the radical changes and developments in the academic and intellectual fields, American scholars like Roger Abrahams, Dan Benamos, Alan Duns, Kenneth Goldstein, and Robert Gorges began to take folklore items within multidimensional frameworks. In this new enlightened approach, the items of folklore began to be seen not merely as texts but as events, where the contexts of folk performances, like storytelling, singing, rituals and festivals, and conversations, were regarded as important as the texts. However, the root of such outlook can be seen in the works of Parry and Lord of oral formulaic theory, where attention was given to the contextual data of oral epic singing. The works of the contextualists involve comprehensive fieldwork for holistic recording of folklore events, in contrast to the text-oriented exercises of the earlier scholars, shifting the attention more to the field than to the library. 2.6 Growth of folklore studies in India. Material folklore evolving into a nationalistic symbol, Gandhi with the spinning wheel. Let us now focus on the growth of folklore studies in India. Because of its bewildering richness in oral traditions, India enjoyed a special place in the international folklore scholarship. Its many racial and linguistic cultural traditions caught the attention of many anthropologists and folklorists. The works of Max Muller and Theodore Benfey on Indian myths and folktales bear the testimony how Indian folklore resources contributed to the theoretical development of folklore studies. A characteristic feature of Indian culture and civilization has been the continuity of some of the oldest oral and written traditions of the world, the Vedas, great epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Upanishads and Puranas, and bulky anthologies of folk tales such as Hitopdesa, Brihat Katha, Katsarit Sagar, Betalpankavinsatika, Jathaka do exemplify the vibrancy of oral and written traditional creativity in India since ancient times. However, the study of folklore on Indian soil in modern systematic ways began only after the coming of the British. Jawaharlal Nehru, one of the foremost Scholars of folklore studies from India has divided the growth of folklore studies in India into three periods: the missionary period, the nationalistic period, and the academic period. 2.6.1 The missionary period. The Christian missionaries, who started their mission of spreading Christianity in India since the time of early 19th century, were eventually the first batch of collectors and publishers of the first-hand resources of Indian traditional cultural lives at various regions. These missionaries, who visited the remotest corners of the country for preaching the Christian faith amongst the rural Indians, came in contact with the hitherto unexplored rural traditional settings of the diverse Indian communities. As J. Handu noted, these Anglo-Saxon fathers recorded all kinds of information, habits, manners, customs, oral traditions, rituals, etc. about their subjects. They used some of this information in spreading the Christian faith and were successful in delivering their main message through the native symbols. Most of these writings were published and form a part of the great treasures of folklore we, the Indians, possess about our own past. Looked from this viewpoint, these works of missionaries are of great historical value to a student of Indian folklore. Handu 1989, 135. Though those publications of the missionaries were void of theoretical analysis, of pure academics, their works were, and still are, valuable because of their highly informative contents. Some of such publications were Mary Frey's Old Deccan Days or Hindu Fairy Legends Current in Southern India, 1886, A. J. Dubois Hindu Manners, Customs and Ceremonies, 1897, J. Hindu Novels, Dictionary of Kashmiri Proverbs and Sayings Explained and Illustrated from the Rich and Interesting Folklore of the Valley, 1885, and Folktales of Kashmir, 1893, Orlstein's Hatim's Tales, 1937, Charles E. Grover's The Folk Songs of Southern India, 1894, John Lizarase Dictionary of Tamil Proverbs, 1894. Parallel to the drives of the missionaries, few Western philologists and Orientalists took significant steps of establishing academic societies and starting important periodicals that contributed immensely in the intellectual attention of the Indian cultural resources during this time. The Asiatic Society was founded by William Jones in 1784, and the journals like the Indian Antiquary and the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Bombay gave spaces for brief articles on oral narratives and other genres of folklore. Handu 1989, 134-5. Besides the missionaries, the civil servants of the British administration in India were also engaged in this period in collection and study of Indian folklore materials. Though the motivation behind such works of the colonial administrators was primarily to gather helpful local information for effective administration, they too, like the missionaries, collected and studied various forms of Indian oral traditions in all parts of the country. Some of the worth mentioning works of this kind are Flora Annie Steele's Wide Awake Stories, Tales from Punjab Told by the People, 1894, William C. Crookes' Introduction to the Popular Religion and Folklore of Northern India, 1894, and Natives of Northern India, 1907, S. Mahalinga Natesa, Shastriya's Folklore in Southern India, 1884, and Indian Folktales, 1900, Robinson, Edward Jevitta's Tales and Poems of South India, 1885. George A. Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India, 1903-1907, John F. A. McNair and Thomas Lambert, Barlow's Oral Traditions from Indus, comprised 2 tales to which are added explanatory notes, 1908, E. M. Gordon's Indian Folktales being sidelight on the village life of Bilaspur, Central Provinces, 1908, Cecil Henry Bompa's Folklore of the Santhal Parganas, 1909. James Todd's Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, 1920, etc. These textual productions of the missionaries and civil servants brought the living Indian folklore of those times to the print. These books, periodicals and monographs still serve as valuable references for folkloristic and anthropological researchers in India. 2.6 To the nationalist period. Towards the late 19th century, a sense of Indian nationalism began to grow under the leadership of newly emerging Indian intellectual groups who were enlightened with the Western education and initiated a renewed nationalistic attitude towards their own societies and traditions. Also, the works of the missionaries and civil servants, who brought a bulk of textual production on Indian local traditions, indirectly contributed to a sense of nationalistic consciousness amongst the Indian intellectuals. Such sentiments got momentum, along with the Indian struggle, which began in 1857 to achieve independence from the British. Indian scholars and intellectuals began to search and establish their cultural roots by exploring their own culture and tradition. Some of the major works of this period are Lakshmi Besbarua's Barhiyat, Sashu, 1911, Dinesh Chandra Sen's Sati, 1917, and the folk literature of Bengal, 1920, Zevarchand Meghani's Halardan, 1928, Dadajini Veto, 1933, Lok Sahitya and Kankavati, 1947, Suryakran Parikh's and Narottam Swami's Dhola Marura, Doha, 1947, Ramnaresh Tripathi's Hamara Gram Sahitya, 1940, Devendra Satyarthi's Bela Phule Aadhi Raat, 1948, Gharth Gat Hai, 1948, Dheere Bahu Ganga, 1948, and many others. Besides straight collections and anthologies of folklore materials, many Indian creative writers brought literary productions in the forms of novel, drama, poetry and short stories that were either based on or highlighting the local folklore themes. Besides the Indian scholars and authors, few Western scholars also contributed heavily in the collection and study of Indian folklore during this time. Especially noteworthy is the works of Verrier Elwin, whose important books were Songs of the Forest, The Folk Poetry of the Gonds, 1935, Folktales of Mahakosal, 1944, Folk Songs of Michael Hills, Folk Songs of Chhattisgarh, 1946, Myths of Middle India, 1949, Tribal Myths of Odisha, 1954, and Myths of the Tribal Frontier Agency, 1958. The treatment of the local folklore materials in India by the Indians during this time is significant in many ways. Firstly, for the first time an Indian perspective began to work on the study of Indian folklore during this period. Prior to that, it was either the distant foreign Indologists or Christian missionaries or the colonial British administrators who put the data of Indian folklore with their non-Indian viewpoints. Secondly, folkloric resources began to be associated with national unity and identity, which was apparent all throughout the Indian freedom movement. The discourse of the khadi costumes and Mahatma Gandhi's spinning wheel are the most visible examples of it. Folklore played the crucial role of the medium of spreading Indian national unity both in pre- and post-independence times. 2.6.3 The academic period. The academic period of Indian folklore studies, when one would see the formal study and research in institutionalized settings such as colleges and universities, began after the Indian independence in 1947. The necessary stimulus required for this was gained in the spirit of the nationalistic period. If the missionary period was marked with collection of raw data on Indian folklore and the nationalistic period was filled with patriotic emotions, the academic period was featured with objectives of truth-finding about and scientific analysis and preservation of Indian folklore by the Indians. Like the case in many other countries, study of folklore in Indian educational institutions remained annexed with the departments like anthropology, history, and literary studies. In 1955, Guwahati University started a folklore archive which was later converted to the Department of Tribal Culture and Folklore Research, the first department of folklore in an Indian university. Many other Indian universities in later times opened their departments for offering MA, M.Phil, and PhD courses in folklore studies. Besides governmental colleges and universities, non-governmental centers like the National Folklore Support Center also grew up for promotion and dissemination of folklore scholarship in India. Interdisciplinary approach, international collaborations and applications of contemporary theories and perspectives in the field of humanities and social sciences mark the folklore studies in India of this period. Some of the notable folklore scholars of this time are Birinchi Kumar Barua, A. K. Ramanujan, Jawaharlal Nehru, Prafulladatta Goswami, Birendranath Datta, etc. 2.7 Summary. In this unit, we have discussed in detail the various stages in the development and growth of folklore studies across the world, as well as in India. We have tried to understand the various nationalist and ideological motivations that have been instrumental in the development of the discipline. We have also highlighted the different biases that may creep into folklore analysis if precaution is not ensured regarding the role that ideology plays in folklore studies. In specific reference to India, we have highlighted the stages during the modern period that have shaped the study of folklore. The stages like missionary stage, nationalist stage, and the academic stage have had peculiar features depending upon their historical specificities, bringing fresh insights into the study and understanding of folklore in the country. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.